Okay, so before I actually talk about anything that we're going to do in terms of social, emotional, and mental health and wellness, I want to just frame the importance of this to us in terms of why the Hatch School is something that why we decided to start the Hatch School, right? So students have increasingly over the time in my career have exhibited way more anxiety, both generally and about school specifically. School can be a really stressful place. There was a study that I do not cannot cite right now because I wasn't planning to, but that said that students in high achieving high schools experience as much stress, like as measured by kind of cortisol, as students whose parents are incarcerated. And I was just blown away by that and also not that surprised, right? The pressure of being in high school, as high school is no longer framed as a thing that is its own thing, but it's a means to an end, and that end is college, and it is a measure of your worth as a person, of what colleges you get into and where you go. Like that framing is so damaging to students, and it's caused a real increase in stress. So, what we want to do and like our a lot of our whole framing of creating this program for the Hatch School has been about how can we create a school program that is still really challenging, that still helps students really develop the cognitive skills that they need to be successful wherever they go at the end of school, and also does not push them to develop this type of anxiety about being in school and what the school measures about them and says about their worth as a person, right? Like, how do we separate those two things as much as possible? So, a lot of what we're doing is about how can we set up systems that don't incentivize doing things that are not in service of caring for yourself, right? That's part of why we decided to move away from letter grades. That's part of why we're really emphasizing individual pacing and revision, right? We think that those are things that are going to be helpful to students as they navigate high school, and it's also why we're really emphasizing community, right? Like being connected to other people in your school community is a greater indicator of your both your well-being and your academic success than anything else. So what can we need to invest in building those connections early on so that they can then support students in making the growth they need when they are old later on in their high school timing. So we also think that this sometimes schools think that this just happens by like setting aside time and like buying a cotton candy machine and we're all going to hang out, and like there's some truth to that, right? Like having student directed social time is in fact really rejuvenating for adolescents, and like I don't want to say that we're not going to do that at all, but we also need to provide active instruction to students about what it means to be in like to act in ways that are in service of your own self-care, right? Like students need that instruction. So we'll be doing that instruction in class, right? So like in the context of like, hey, here we are in biology, we're going to take a moment, we're going to say like, let's talk about this project that we're working on, right? And here are some, successful ways that you can be framing your growth on this project. And here are some ways that are not going to be helpful to you, right? Like it does not make sense to think about, your accomplishment on this project as something that is speaking to your, you know, should you be staying up all night working on this? No, you should not, right? Like that type of kind of individual coaching, and also instruction about how you can, what are effective ways to manage your workload, right? How can you advocate for yourself with a teacher, right? How do you think about your short term goals and how they relate to your long term goals and whether they are in conflict with each other? This is a big one for adolescents, right? Is that like, oh, my long term goal is, what's your goal? Oh, my goal is to get an A on this test. Okay, why? Well, because I want to get an A in the class. Okay, why? Because I want to go to a good college. Okay, why? Because I want to get a good job. Okay, why? Right? Like, and they have a hard time making that connection, right? And sometimes they make short-term decisions that are expedient when they think about their short-term goals, but are in fact in conflict with their long-term goals, right? So the more work we can do to help like lift the veil on that for adolescents, I think the better we'll be. Um, so that's something that happens in class in the context of the particular tasks that students are doing in class. Something that will have active instruction on an advisory, and particularly in ninth grade advisory about the transition to high school. Um, And then also, I think affinity groups are a really valuable space for this as well, right? Like, what does it mean, right? If I am a student who identifies as neurodivergent, and I'm here in a room with other students who identify as neurodivergent, like, what does it mean for us to think about advocating for ourselves in a wider community? What does it mean to make sure that I am taking care of myself in a community where sometimes I feel like that experience, that identity of mine is a little bit dissonant, right? Like, how can we have those conversations? Um, and also another big part of that is developing vocabulary for conflict resolution, right? Like when you're in a diverse community, like conflicts happen, right? So like how can we develop ways that students can engage in conflict without it becoming a tremendous source of stress, right? So that we can redirect and reset, and that students feel like that they have a depth of tools that don't activate more and more conflict and instead work towards resolution. Okay, in terms of support for students who are experiencing a higher level of stress in either social, emotional, mental health, right? Like that they're in the moment having a higher level of stress. We, as a small school, we are not going to have a counselor on staff at first, but we have two things in place that we are going to do in order to support students who are experiencing a higher need of care. One is that we're working on developing a partnership with a community mental health organization that can serve as our like escalation people. One of the things I think that'll be really nice about that model is that there will probably be more than one counselor at that site, so that it doesn't necessarily have to be a one size fits all, like, oh, this is our counselor, and like if you want to talk to somebody, that's the person, right? There'll be more flexibility about who can respond to a particular student's situation based on their unique needs. So I think that's pretty exciting. Um, and that hope ideally the partner that we'll be able to provide will both be able to have some availability to do in the moment kind of this huge thing came up, we need support right now, right? And also be able to do short term like one-on-one counseling and make referrals to longer term supports that can be put in place, right? So those are our goals for what we'll be able to develop with that partnership as we seek it out. And now that we have a location, we have more ability to actively seek partners, because we do think it's really important that that would be somebody who is like proximately located so that students can have access to that person in the real world and not just online. Another thing that we're going to do is, I think a good way of thinking about it is that we require all teachers in a school to be CPR and first aid certified in the event that there is some sort of an emergency that happens. But there's not always the same expectation that adults in a community have training so that they can respond to a student who is experiencing an acute um, moment of distress in terms of their social, emotional, or mental wellness. There are programs that are essentially the equivalent of like a CPR or first aid training, right? Like a 2-day training for teachers that is essentially an emotional mental health first aid class, right? And making sure that those adults have the tools to de-escalate situations, to provide, to not make things worse in the moment, I think is a lot of it, right? And to make sure that that student is supported until they can get to a higher level of care, just like with regular first aid. The point is not for this person to be the provider of the healthcare, but to provide an effective transition to somebody who can provide ongoing support, right? So we're going to be doing trainings with our faculty to make sure that every person on campus has at least that level of um, skill in being able to support students who have acute needs for that. We're working, well, we've looked at a couple of different providers, but there's one that we may end up certifying with. We'll be announcing that like when we actually develop that partnership, but we don't have that finalized yet. And then lastly, an important part is care coordination, right? So when students do get connected with somebody who is providing ongoing support for them in terms of emotional, mental, or social health outside of school, that we are always willing to support care coordination with their provider and make sure that what we are doing at school is in support of their long-term treatment goals. So that is our plan. For the first time today, I am done 3 minutes early. So if anybody has any questions about social, emotional, mental health, or wellness, I'd love to take them. Or we can maybe even have a slightly longer break. Up to you guys.
I had a question.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Mm-mm. It doesn't say you're muted, but I can't hear you.
It's okay.
Oh, it's just me. Really? Hmm. Okay, let me try something. I changed my speaker. Would you try talking again?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay, great. I have a strange question, maybe. My question is, because this is a um, girl-centered education school, I'm wondering, it's wonderful that the support of the well-being and the balance is happening during school, but when you're trying to help girls be leaders and occupy positions of power, often in the real world, they need to do that by killing themselves. And so I'm just wondering how you help them develop sort of the ability to think about leadership and occupying power positions and spaciousness and self-care in that kind of sunset way.
I love that question so much. And I think, I mean, I wish I had an answer that was just like, oh, here's how we're going to do that, right? Like, here's how we're going to fix the patriarchy in
Yeah.
4 years, right? But I think that the thing that we think about a lot is this idea of rejecting the options that are given to you is an option, right? And like, how do we actively coach students on seeing a third path other than the ones that are presented to them? And I think that that is particularly relevant when you think about this idea of occupying positions of power, right? Like when your choices are like, you can choose to accept this leadership role, but that comes with never having time to take care of yourself ever, right? Or you can choose not to be a leader because like you knew that that's what that came with. Those are garbage choices and you don't have to accept them, right? Like you can say like actually I will be a better leader. I will be in a position to be a better advocate for the community that I am in leading serving as a leader if I have the ability to care for myself, right? Like it's the, thinking about the parenting thing of, you got to put your own
Right.
oxygen mask on, right? Like that, how can we help students learn ways to think about rejecting the choices and respectfully advocating for a different path and I think the way that we're really going to do that is by giving them opportunities to do that at school, right? So like I want them to tell us what we're doing wrong, right? So like when perhaps like imagining things that have happened in the past, like if I give an assignment and students are mad about it, right? That's never happened before. It happens all the time, right? Like, oh, that convincing argument was just too hard, right? Took me too long. I didn't understand the task. It was really frustrating. And how can I receive that feedback? Well, I can say, well, it's your problem. Like you just didn't work on it hard enough. Uh, Too many teachers do that. That's not been my MO. I think more commonly my MO might have been, oh, tell me more about that so that I can adjust this moving forward, right? What I want the HAT school's default response to be is like, how can you advocate in the moment? Like, what could you have done 3 days ago to explain why this wasn't working for you instead of saying, hey, like at the end of this, it was it was not good, right? And then like kind of doing, you know, building those skills incrementally so that students have more practice reflecting on how they might intervene in the
Advocating in the
moment
moment.
to achieve
That's a
that.
great answer. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah, yeah.